The sound of crumpling paper echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. I watched in frozen terror as Richard smoothed out the letter I thought I had hidden so carefully, his face transforming into something monstrous as he read my son's words. The letter that would either save my life or end it had just been discovered, and after 21 years of marriage, I knew exactly what that look in his eyes meant. "So this is what you've been planning, Martha," he whispered, his voice deadly calm. "My own wife conspiring behind my back like some common whore." My name is Martha Jean Thompson, and I'm 87 years old now. The lines on my face tell a story of both joy and pain, though for many years the pain overshadowed everything else. But that April morning in 1974, staring into the face of the man who had destroyed my youth and stolen my child, I finally found the courage that had eluded me for 2 decades. Sometimes the most painful choices are the ones we make out of love. I was born in Sun City, Arizona in 1938, during times when women were expected to find satisfaction in marriage and motherhood alone. The desert was harsh and unforgiving, but it taught you patience, endurance, and the art of survival in impossible conditions. Perhaps that's why I managed to stay silent for so long about what happened behind the closed doors of my marriage. The spring of 1953 changed everything. I was 15, all arms and legs and dreams, working at my father's drugstore after school. The bell above the door chimed that Thursday afternoon, and in walked a man who would reshape my entire existence. Richard Thompson, 22 years old, devastatingly handsome in his army uniform, fresh from the Korean War, with stories that made the local girls swoon. He had piercing blue eyes that seemed to see right through you and a smile that could charm the thorns off a cactus. Every Thursday, he'd order a chocolate malt and leave me a generous tip, winking as he walked out. The other girls at school were green with envy. That Thompson boy's got his eye on you, Martha." My mother would say, equal parts worried and impressed. "He's older, more experienced. You be careful around him." But Richard knew exactly how to win people over. He brought my father expensive cigars from the city, helped my mother carry groceries without being asked, and spoke respectfully about his service to our country. Such a gentleman, everyone said. You don't find many like him these days. By the time I turned 17, my parents had given their blessing for us to court properly. The whole town watched our romance unfold like something from the movies. Richard would pick wildflowers on his way home from his job at the bank, surprising me with bouquets of desert blooms. We'd drive to the lake on weekends, talking about the future we'd build together. "I'm going to give you everything, Martha," he promised one sunset evening, holding my hand as we watched the sky burn orange and purple over the desert landscape. "A house, children, security, you'll never want for anything." I believed him completely. We married in June 1956, right after I graduated high school. I can still remember every detail: my white dress with the lace collar that had belonged to my grandmother, how my hands trembled as I held my bouquet of white roses, and baby's breath, the way the entire town seemed to pack into the little church. Richard was well respected by then, working his way up at the bank, charming everyone with his war stories and ambitious plans. "You're lucky to have found such a good man, Martha," Mrs. Henderson told me at the reception, patting my hand with her wrinkled fingers. "He'll take good care of you." For the first year, our marriage was everything I'd dreamed of as a young girl. Richard bought us a small house on the outskirts of town with a front porch where I'd sit in the evenings watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. We'd talk about having children, about the life we'd build in this tight-knit community, where everyone knew everyone else's business. The first crack in paradise appeared 2 weeks after I told him I was pregnant. It was a Tuesday morning, March 1957. I had burned his breakfast. The eggs were too hard, the toast too dark, coffee too bitter. In my excitement about the baby, I'd been distracted, lost in dreams of little hands and first steps. "Jesus Christ, Martha, can't you do anything right?" Richard snapped, pushing his plate away so violently that it crashed to the floor, egg yolks spreading across the linoleum like a broken promise. "I'm sorry, honey. I was just thinking about—" The slap came so fast, I didn't see it coming. 1 minute, I was apologizing. The next, I was on the kitchen floor, my cheek-burning ears ringing from the impact. The taste of blood filled my mouth where my teeth had cut my tongue. Richard immediately dropped to his knees beside me, tears streaming down his face, his hands shaking as he reached for me. "Oh God, Martha, I don't know what came over me. I'm so sorry, baby. I swear on my mother's grave, it'll never happen again. Please forgive me. Please." I believed him. I had to. There was a baby coming, and in 1957, divorce wasn't something respectable women considered. Besides, I loved him. And when he wasn't angry, he was still the same charming man who'd won my heart with chocolate malts and wildflowers. But it did happen again. And again. Always followed by tears, by promises, by periods of perfect happiness that made me believe things were finally changing. I learned to hide the bruises with makeup, to tell neighbors I was clumsy when they noticed my split lips or black eyes, that Martha's always walking into doors. I'd laugh while Richard put his arm around me protectively. Good thing I have such a patient husband. When Michael was born, in January 1958, everything changed again. For a few precious months, it got better. Richard would come home from the bank and cradle our son with such tenderness, it brought tears to my eyes. He'd sing lullabies in a voice so gentle, it made me forget about the bruises still healing under my sleeves. "This is what I've always wanted, Martha," he'd whisper, holding Michael against his chest as our son slept. "You've given me everything. This is our fresh start." I wanted desperately to believe him. Michael was perfect dark hair like mine, Richard's strong chin, and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the world. When he laughed, the sound filled our little house with more joy than I'd ever thought possible. But fresh starts, I learned, require more than good intentions. Richard lost his job at the bank in the summer of 1959. He claimed it was downsizing, told everyone in town that new management was cleaning house. But years later, I would discover he'd been caught embezzling from customer accounts, stealing money to cover gambling debts I knew nothing about. The bank president, a family friend, had quietly let him resign rather than press charges. Richard began drinking heavily. He'd disappear for days at a time, leaving me alone with Michael and no money for groceries. When he came home, the slightest thing would set him off, Michael crying dinner, not being ready, me asking where he'd been. The violence escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. The first time he hurt Michael, our son, was just 18 months old. It was a Saturday evening in August 1959. Richard had been drinking all day, celebrating what he called his freedom from those bank bastards. Michael, curious and fearless, the way toddlers are, knocked over Richard's whiskey glass while trying to reach a toy. The sound of shattering glass seemed to trigger something primal in my husband. He grabbed Michael by his little arm, lifting him completely off the ground. I watched in horror as my baby's face contorted in pain and confusion, his screams echoing through our small house. "Richard, stop! He's just a baby!" I lunged forward, desperate to protect my child. Richard's backhanded blow sent me flying into the wall, knocking the wind out of me. As I gasped for air, he threw Michael into his crib with such force that our son's cries turned to whimpers of terror. That night, as I sat beside Michael's crib examining the finger-shaped bruises on his tiny arm, Richard appeared in the doorway. His voice was eerily calm, almost conversational. "If you ever try to leave me, Martha, I'll find you, and I'll make sure you never see that boy again. Maybe he won't be around for you to see at all, if you catch my meaning." I knew he meant every word. The cold certainty in his eyes left no room for doubt. For 3 more years, I endured it. I tried everything, being the perfect wife, keeping Michael quiet. When Richard was home, reaching out to our pastor, who told me to pray harder and be more submissive to my husband's needs. "Marriage is a sacred covenant," Martha Reverend Phillips intoned from behind his massive oak desk. God tests us through tribulation. Perhaps if you focused less on worldly concerns and more on serving your family, these difficulties would resolve themselves. Nothing helped. If anything, the violence grew worse as Richard's drinking increased and his job prospects dwindled. By 1960, he was working sporadically in construction, often coming home covered in dust and rage, looking for any excuse to unleash his frustration on us. My salvation arrived in the form of my sister Caroline in March 1961. She lived in Minneapolis, had never married, and worked as a secretary for a law firm, a modern woman by any standards. Caroline had always been the smart one, the one who asked difficult questions and refused to accept easy answers. She came to visit for Michael's 3rd birthday, taking the train from Minnesota with a suitcase full of presents and high expectations for a joyful reunion. What she found instead was a house full of secrets and a sister who jumped at unexpected sounds. "What happened to your face, Martha?" she asked quietly on her first morning, studying the yellow-green bruise on my jaw that makeup couldn't quite hide. "I walked into a door." I replied automatically, the lie rolling off my tongue with practiced ease. You know how clumsy I can be. But Caroline had always been able to see through my deceptions, even as children. She watched Michael that day, noticed how he flinched whenever a door slammed, how he went silent and still when footsteps approached, how he instinctively positioned himself behind furniture when adults raised their voices. That night, after Richard had gone out drinking with his construction crew, Caroline confronted me in the kitchen while I washed dishes with shaking hands. "This isn't just about you anymore, Martha. Look at that child. Really look at him." Her voice was gentle but firm, the voice of someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize truth when she saw it. What kind of man will Michael grow up to be if this is all he sees? What kind of woman will he think it's acceptable to become? The plate I was washing slipped from my soapy hands, shattering in the sink. As I stared at the broken pieces, something inside me shattered too. For the first time in years, I told someone the complete truth. I told Caroline about the escalating violence, about Richard's threats, about the nights I lay awake planning escape routes that always ended in imagined disasters. I showed her the bruises, the scars, the places where my body had been reshaped by violence. Most importantly, I told her about my deepest fear, that Richard would kill us both before he'd ever let us leave. "Then don't leave together," Caroline said after a long silence. "Not at first." That night, by lamplight at my kitchen table, we crafted a plan so audacious it terrified me. Michael would go with Caroline back to Minneapolis, ostensibly for an extended visit with his aunt. I would stay behind, endure whatever punishment Richard inflicted for allowing this separation, and slowly, carefully build my own escape route. "It's too dangerous," I whispered, my hands trembling as we discussed details. "If he suspects anything—" Martha listened to me. "Richard has friends in the police department, connections throughout this town. If you disappear together, he'll report a kidnapping. He'll have every law enforcement officer in 3 states looking for you." Caroline leaned across the table, gripping my hands with surprising strength. "But if you stay, if you can convince him that Michael's visit is temporary, you buy yourself time to plan properly, to save money, to find somewhere he'd never think to look." The desert had taught me patience. Sometimes to survive, you have to play the long game. We spent the next 2 days preparing Michael for his vacation with Aunt Caroline. He was excited about riding the train, about seeing snow for the first time, about the adventures Caroline promised him. Breaking my heart, he asked repeatedly when I would join them. "Soon, sweetheart." I promised, holding him close and memorizing the feel of his small body in my arms. "Mommy has some important work to do here first, but I'll come for you. No matter what happens, I will come for you." I packed his favorite teddy bear, a photograph of me, and enough clothes for what was supposed to be a 2-week visit. As I tucked the photograph into his small suitcase, I whispered a prayer that someday, somehow, I would keep my promise to my son. The night Caroline and Michael left for Minneapolis, I told Richard about their departure with all the casual nonchalance I could muster. I'd prepared for his explosion, but his reaction was worse than I'd anticipated. "You let that interfering bitch take my son without asking me," he roared, grabbing me by the hair and slamming my head against the refrigerator. "What gave you the right to make decisions about my boy?" For the next hour, he unleashed fury unlike anything I'd experienced. When it was over, I was curled on the kitchen floor, tasting blood, struggling to breathe through what I later learned were 3 cracked ribs. But Michael was safe, miles away from this violence, and that knowledge carried me through the pain. "He'll be back in 2 weeks," I gasped when Richard finally stopped hitting me. "Caroline just wanted some time with her only nephew. You know how women get about children." Richard studied me with suspicious eyes, but gradually accepted my explanation. 2 weeks passed, then 3. His rage when Michael didn't return was volcanic, but Caroline had prepared brilliantly. She'd obtained legal documents showing temporary guardianship backdated with forged signatures, and the help of a lawyer friend who understood what we were really doing. When Richard called the police to report a kidnapping, the investigation fizzled out within days. Caroline's documentation was flawless, and Michael appeared happy and healthy in the photographs she sent to authorities. Without evidence of wrongdoing, the case was quietly closed. And I stayed. For 15 years, I endured Richard's escalating violence, his paranoid accusations, his complete control over every aspect of my existence. But I also planned, saved, and survived, sustained by secret communications with my son. The letters were my lifeline. Every month, if I was lucky, I'd receive an innocuous-looking envelope from Mrs. Abernathy Caroline's elderly neighbor, who had agreed to serve as our messenger. She'd address them as if they were newsletters from a quilting circle, content that Richard would never bother reading. Inside, I'd find updates about Michael's life, his first day of school, his achievement in mathematics, his love for baseball, his growth from a traumatized toddler into a confident young man. "He asks about you constantly." One letter reported when Michael was 7. "Caroline tells him you're sick and can't travel, but that you love him more than all the stars in the sky. He keeps your photograph on his nightstand and says goodnight to it every evening." I memorized every word of every letter before burning them in the kitchen sink, destroying evidence of the most precious correspondence of my life. But the words lived on in my heart, treasures I could revisit during the darkest moments of my marriage. The years blurred together in a haze of survival and sacrifice. Richard's drinking worsened, making him unpredictable, but often too intoxicated to be as violent as before. He lost job after job, his reputation in town gradually crumbling as people realized the charming war hero was actually a volatile drunk who couldn't hold steady employment. I found work at Rosie's Diner, a local institution run by a tough old woman who asked no questions when I showed up with bruises, but occasionally slipped me extra money for emergencies. The work was hard but honest, and every dollar I earned went toward my secret escape fund hidden beneath a loose floorboard in our bedroom closet. $1 at a time, 1/4 tip after another, I built my freedom. And with every penny saved, I whispered to myself, one day closer to Michael. Dr. Sarah Cohen arrived in our town in 1968, a woman who defied every convention our conservative community held dear. Unmarried, at 35, educated at prestigious Eastern universities, Jewish, in a predominantly Christian town, she might as well have been from Mars for all the curiosity and suspicion she generated. She opened a small medical practice in a converted house near the center of town, offering services that the male doctors somehow couldn't or wouldn't provide. Women began whispering about her sharing stories of compassionate care and non-judgmental treatment that felt revolutionary in our insular world. Dr. Cohen came to the diner every Wednesday for lunch, always ordering the same meal, turkey sandwich on rye, no mayonnaise, black coffee, and a slice of whatever pie Rosie had fresh. She'd bring medical journals reading while she ate, completely comfortable in her own company. One autumn afternoon, she looked up as I refilled her coffee cup and said, That wrist needs proper medical attention. I'd sprained it 2 nights earlier, when Richard twisted my arm behind my back during one of his rages. I'd wrapped it tightly with an elastic bandage and come to work as usual, but apparently my injury was more obvious than I'd hoped. "It's nothing," I said, quickly pulling my sleeve down to hide the swelling. "Just clumsy me." Dr. Cohen held my gaze for a long moment, her intelligent eyes seeing far more than I wanted them to see. "My office is open until 7 on Thursdays. No appointment necessary." I never went to her office. I couldn't risk Richard finding out, but Dr. Cohen kept coming to the diner. Sometimes she'd leave informational pamphlets under her plate along with her tip resources about women's shelters in Phoenix, information about legal aid phone numbers for crisis hotlines. I'd quickly pocket them heart-racing and read them in the bathroom during my break before destroying them. Through these small acts of kindness, I began to understand that I wasn't completely alone. There were people in the world who recognized suffering when they saw it, who offered help without judgment or expectation. Dr. Cohen never pressed me directly, never demanded explanations, but her quiet support reminded me that somewhere beyond my prison, compassionate people still existed. Meanwhile, Michael was growing up in Minneapolis safe under Caroline's care. The letters told me he was excelling in school, particularly in mathematics and science. He'd joined the baseball team, made friends, developed the confidence that had been stripped away during his earliest years with Richard. At 13, he had his first girlfriend, a red-headed girl named Penny, who made him laugh. Caroline ensured he got braces for his crooked teeth, took him fishing on weekends, helped him with homework, and loved him as fiercely as any parent could. "He's becoming quite the young man," Mrs. Abernathy wrote in 1970. "Taller than Caroline now, with a deeper voice that cracks when he's excited about something. She says he gets this little furrow between his eyebrows when he's concentrating hard, exactly like you used to do." That letter made me weep so hard, I had to run the shower to muffle my sobs. My baby wasn't a baby anymore. He was 16, practically a man, and I had missed it all. The guilt was crushing, but so was the knowledge that he was alive, healthy, and thriving in ways he never could have if I'd kept him in our house of horrors. By 1973, I had saved nearly $3,000 a fortune by my standards earned through 15 years of careful planning and relentless frugality. I was 45 years old, my auburn hair streaked with premature gray, my face mapped with lines that spoke of endurance rather than laughter. But hidden beneath those floorboards was proof that I had never given up hope. Richard had settled into a predictable pattern of decline. He drank heavily, but hit less frequently, often too intoxicated to do much more than shout incoherently. Our house deteriorated along with our marriage, peeling paint, leaking roof, overgrown yard, a physical manifestation of the decay that had consumed our lives. I continued working at the diner, hiding money, and dreaming of the day when Michael would be fully grown, established in his own life, safe from any possibility of Richard's retaliation. Once my son was truly independent, I would disappear into a new life, somewhere far from the Arizona desert, where memories of violence were embedded in every grain of sand. Then came the letter that would change everything. It arrived on a Tuesday in February 1974, mixed in with the usual bills and advertisements that constituted our meager mail. But this envelope was different, addressed directly to me in handwriting I didn't recognize, with a Minneapolis postmark that made my heart stop. I waited until Richard left for his sporadic construction work before opening it, my hands trembling so violently I could barely manage the envelope. Inside was a letter that began with 2 words that nearly broke me: "Dear Mom." My son had found his voice, and he was reaching across 15 years of separation to reclaim his mother. "Aunt Caroline thinks I shouldn't write this." The letter continued. "She says it might put you in danger. But I'm 20 now, and I deserve to know the truth. I deserve to understand why my mother sent me away, but wouldn't come herself." The handwriting was neat, precise, a man's writing, not the child's scrawl I remembered. This stranger, who was my son, wrote with intelligence and purpose, asking questions that cut straight to the heart of every choice I'd made. I've known pieces of the story for years. Caroline tried to protect me when I was younger, telling me you were sick, that you'd come when you could. But as I got older, I started asking harder questions. Last year, on my 19th birthday, she finally told me everything. About Richard. About the abuse. About the choice you made to save me while staying behind yourself. I had to press my hand against my mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to expose me. My beautiful boy had grown up knowing the truth of his abandonment, carrying the weight of understanding that no child should bear. I was angry at first. He continued with brutal honesty. Angry that you didn't fight harder, that you didn't come with me that day, that you chose to stay with a monster rather than be with your son. I couldn't understand what kind of mother would make that choice. Each word was a deserved blade between my ribs. How many times had I asked myself the same questions, tortured myself with the same accusations? But then Caroline showed me the letters. All the letters you'd written over the years that Mrs. Abernathy passed along. She'd kept every single one, 172 letters, Mom. 172 pieces of your heart that you sent across the country to a son who couldn't write back. I hadn't known Caroline had preserved them. I'd imagined her reading them to Michael when he was small, then discarding them like any other male. The thought that my words, my love, had been carefully maintained all these years overwhelmed me completely. I read them all in one weekend. I learned how you worked double shifts to save money for escape, how you celebrated my birthdays in secret, how you kept track of every milestone even though you weren't there to witness them. In one letter from 1965, you described walking by the elementary school during recess just to hear the sound of children my age playing. I remembered that letter, written during a particularly dark period, when Richard had broken my collarbone, and the pain medication had made me vulnerable, more revealing in my words than I'd ever intended to be. In your letters, I found the mother I'd never known. The woman who sang, "You Are My Sunshine" to herself on my birthday each year. The woman who kept a pebble I'd given her when I was 3 in her work apron, touching it like a talisman throughout each day. The woman who endured hell so that I wouldn't have to. The letter continued, revealing that Michael was studying engineering at the University of Minnesota, that he was thriving academically and socially, that Caroline had given him opportunities I never could have provided. But more than that, it revealed a young man of extraordinary character who had somehow emerged from our family's trauma with compassion intact. I don't want to just read about your life anymore, Mom. I want to be part of it. And I want you to be part of mine. What followed was not just sentiment, but a detailed plan. Michael and Caroline had been working for months to orchestrate my escape. They'd rented an apartment in Seattle, secured me a job interview at a bookstore, consulted with lawyers about protection if Richard came looking. Every detail had been considered, every obstacle anticipated. We'll be in Phoenix on April 17th. I've booked 2 rooms at the Holiday Inn on Central Avenue. I'll wait there while Caroline comes to get you. All you need to do is be ready. Pack only what you can carry in one bag. Leave while he's at work or asleep. Take a bus to Phoenix and call this number from the station. Paper clipped to the letter was $30 for bus fare and a business card with a phone number written on the back. If April 17th doesn't work, we'll wait. A day, a week, a month, however long it takes. But please, Mom, don't make it another 15 years. I've lived most of my life without you. I don't want to miss any more. The letter ended simply, I love you, I forgive you. Come home to me, your son Michael. April the 17th, 1974. The date burned itself into my consciousness like a brand. After 15 years of dreaming and planning and enduring, my salvation had been given a specific day on the calendar. But between the letter's arrival and that promised date stretched 3 weeks that would test every ounce of courage I'd managed to accumulate. Richard had grown increasingly paranoid in recent months, his drinking accompanied by wild accusations and suspicious scrutiny of my every movement. He'd accused me of having affairs with customers at the diner, of stealing money from his wallet, of poisoning his food. Just the week before, he'd grabbed my arm hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises when I took what he considered too long at the grocery store. Hiding my excitement and hope became the performance of my lifetime. I went about my daily routines with the same defeated resignation I'd displayed for years, all while my heart hammered with anticipation of freedom. Every morning, when Richard left for work, when he had work, I fought the urge to immediately begin packing. Every evening, when he came home drunk and belligerent, I struggled not to see it as just another day closer to never having to endure his presence again. The waiting was excruciating, but it also gave me time to prepare carefully. I worked extra shifts at the diner, telling Richard that Rosie was short-staffed due to spring tourist season. The additional money went directly into my escape fund. I mentally inventoried my few precious possessions, deciding what could fit in a single bag and what would have to be left behind. Photographs would come with me, the few pictures I had of my parents, of Michael, as a baby, of the woman I used to be, before marriage taught me to make myself invisible. My mother's locket, the only jewelry that mattered, would be tucked safely in my dress pocket. Everything else could be replaced or abandoned. Most importantly, I memorized every detail of Michael's escape plan, reading his letter so many times I could recite it word for word before burning it to ash in the kitchen sink. The Holiday Inn on Central Avenue in Phoenix, room 215. The phone number, written in his careful handwriting. The bus schedule that would take me from my desert prison to my desert salvation. 10 days before the planned escape, Richard cornered me in our bedroom, his breath heavy with whiskey and suspicion. "You've been acting strange lately, Martha. Distant, like you're planning something." His eyes were bloodshot but alert, studying my face for signs of deception. "You wouldn't be stupid enough to try something, would you? After all these years, you know what happens to wives who think they can make fools of their husbands." I did know. I'd seen it happen to other women in our town, wives who'd tried to leave and ended up in the hospital or worse. Mrs. Daniels down the street had attempted to take her children and disappear in 1968. She'd been found 3 days later, beaten so severely she'd spent months in recovery, her spirit broken beyond repair. I'm not planning anything, Richard," I replied, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. "Where would I go? I don't have anyone." He grabbed my chin, forcing me to meet his gaze. "Damn right you don't. And you better remember that, Martha. You belong to me. Till death do us part, just like you promised in that church." That night, I lay awake listening to his snores, wondering if April 17th was a fantasy I'd never realize. Was I being watched more closely than I realized? Had Richard somehow intercepted Michael's letter despite my precautions? Was my son already in Phoenix waiting for a mother who would never arrive? The fear nearly paralyzed me. But then I remembered something from one of Dr. Cohen's pamphlets. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in the face of fear. I had 3 choices: stay and die slowly in this prison of a marriage, try to escape, and possibly die quickly if Richard caught me, or trust my son's plan and perhaps finally live. April 16th dawned clear and merciless, the Arizona sun, already promising another scorching day. I woke before Richard, my entire body humming with nervous energy that I struggled to contain. One more day. After 15 years of waiting, just 24 more hours until I could reclaim my life. Richard was unusually quiet that morning, nursing his hangover with black coffee and suspicious glances. He'd been drinking heavily the night before, celebrating what he claimed was a big construction job starting next week, work that I knew probably didn't exist, just another story to maintain his rapidly crumbling self-respect. "You seem awfully chipper for someone who's supposed to be at work in an hour," he said, studying me over his coffee cup. Something special about today. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my expression to remain neutral. "Just glad it's almost the weekend. Rosie said she might give me Saturday off if business is slow." Richard grunted and returned his attention to his coffee, but I could feel him watching me as I moved around the kitchen, making his eggs exactly the way he liked them, buttering his toast to the precise shade of golden brown he demanded. One last performance of the dutiful wife I would never have to be again. At the diner, the day dragged with surreal slowness. Every customer seemed to linger longer than usual, every order more complicated, every minute stretched like taffy in the desert heat. I found myself memorizing details I'd overlooked for years, the way the morning light slanted through the windows, casting patterns on the worn linoleum. How Rosie hummed along to the radio as she worked the grill. The particular squeak of the swinging door between the kitchen and dining room. These would all be memories, soon fragments of a life I was about to leave behind forever. "You feelin' all right, honey?" Rosie asked during the afternoon lull, studying my face with the sharp attention of someone who'd spent decades reading people's troubles in their expressions. "You seem, I don't know, different today." "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "Richard's been in one of his moods lately." Rosie nodded knowingly. She'd never asked directly about my marriage, but her occasional gentle questions and extra kindnesses told me she understood more than she ever said aloud. "You know, Martha, sometimes a woman's got to make hard choices about what kind of life she wants to live." She spoke quietly, wiping down the counter with more attention than it required. "Sometimes the hardest choice is the right one." I looked at her sharply, wondering if somehow she'd guessed what I was planning, but Rosie just smiled and handed me a fresh pot of coffee to serve to the afternoon regulars. That evening, I cooked Richard's favorite meal pot roast with potatoes and carrots, green beans seasoned the way his mother used to make them. I wore the blue dress he'd always complimented, styled my graying hair the way he preferred, laughed at his crude jokes with seemingly genuine amusement. It was my farewell performance, the final act of a play I'd been starring in for nearly 20 years. "You're in a good mood tonight." Richard observed his words, slightly slurred from the beer he'd been nursing since arriving home. "Makes a man appreciate what he's got at home." I smiled and refilled his glass, all the while calculating that this was the last time I would ever serve this man anything. The last time I would ever have to pretend his attention was welcome. The last time I would go to sleep beside someone who had made my life a walking nightmare. After dinner, I washed dishes while Richard settled in front of the television with another beer. Through the kitchen window, I could see the desert night settling over our little house stars, emerging in the clear sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. Somewhere out there, my son was waiting for me, perhaps looking at those same stars and thinking about the mother he hadn't seen in 15 years. The thought gave me strength as I dried the last plate and hung up the dish towel for the final time. April 17th, 1974 began like any other day in my prison, but every moment thrummed with the electricity of impending freedom. I woke at 5:17, an hour before my alarm, my entire body vibrating with anticipation and terror in equal measure. Richard snored beside me, dead to the world, after another night of heavy drinking, a piece of luck I hadn't dared hope for. I lay still in the gray pre-dawn light, mentally rehearsing every step of the plan Michael had outlined in his letter. Richard would leave for his construction job at 6:30 if he actually had work today and wasn't just leaving to avoid the shame of unemployment. I would go to the diner for my regular morning shift, giving no indication that today was different from any other day I'd worked there over the past 15 years. At noon, I would tell Rosie I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early. Not entirely a lie, as my stomach churned with nervous energy and barely contained panic. Then, instead of going home, I would retrieve my hidden money from beneath the bedroom floorboard, collect the small suitcase I'd stashed behind the water heater in our garage 3 days earlier, and walk to the bus station downtown. If everything went according to plan, I would be in Phoenix by 3:30. I would call the number Michael had provided, and by dinner time, I would be with my son for the first time in 15 years. So simple on paper, so terrifying in reality. Richard stirred beside me, and I immediately closed my eyes, feigning sleep. I listened to his familiar morning routine, the creak of the bed as he stood his shuffling footsteps to the bathroom, the sound of running water, the flush of the toilet. Ordinary sounds that had been the soundtrack to my captivity for nearly 2 decades. I waited until I heard him in the kitchen before rising and dressing in the same uniform I'd worn thousands of times before. Nothing unusual, nothing that would trigger his suspicions. Just another middle-aged waitress preparing for another day of serving coffee and taking orders from people who saw her as part of the scenery. In the kitchen, Richard sat at our small table reading yesterday's newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. The morning light slanted through the window, illuminating the lines that alcohol and anger had etched into his face. He looked older than his 51 years, worn down by disappointments and failures he blamed on everyone but himself. For just a moment, I glimpsed the handsome young soldier who had charmed me in my father's drugstore all those years ago. The man I'd thought would give me a fairy tale life. The stranger who had gradually revealed himself to be a monster. "Working late tonight?" he asked without looking up from his paper. "Just the morning shift," I replied, pouring myself coffee with hands that somehow remained steady. "Rosie's got plenty of coverage for dinner." He grunted acknowledgement and turned the page, already dismissing me from his attention. The casual disregard that had once wounded me now felt like a gift. The less attention he paid to my movements, the better my chances of escape. I made his breakfast exactly as he liked it, eggs over easy bacon crisp, but not burnt toast, golden brown with butter in the corners, the way his mother had prepared it. One last meal for the man who had stolen my youth and terrorized my child. "Have a good day," I said as he prepared to leave, the same words I'd spoken almost every morning for 20 years. He paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back to look at me. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he'd somehow guessed my plans, that this casual morning routine would explode into violence and discovery. "You're a good wife, Martha," he said, his words slightly slurred despite the early hour. "Don't ever forget that. I know I don't tell you enough, but you're a good wife." Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, his truck engine rumbling to life before fading as he drove away. I stood in the sudden silence of our house, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was about to attempt. But there was no time for doubt now. The plan was in motion, and every minute that passed brought me closer to either freedom or disaster. My shift at the diner passed in a blur of routine motions, performed by a woman whose mind was entirely focused on the afternoon ahead. I poured coffee, took orders, and made small talk with regular customers, all while my consciousness counted down the hours until my carefully planned escape. Every time the bell above the door chimed, I jumped, half expecting to see Richard storming in with suspicion and rage in his eyes. But it never was him, just the usual parade of customers seeking comfort food and familiar company in our small desert town. At precisely noon, I approached Rosie at the grill where she was flipping hamburgers for the lunch rush. "I'm not feeling well," I said, pressing a hand to my stomach in what wasn't entirely an act. "Would it be all right if I left early today?" Rosie turned from the grill, studying my face with sharp attention. "You do look pale, honey. Go on home and rest. Take care of yourself." Something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. Her weathered face was kind, but knowing, as if she understood, this wasn't really about a stomach bug. "Thank you," I said impulsively, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "For everything, Rosie. For all these years, for your kindness. Thank you." Her grip tightened on my fingers. "Martha, honey, whatever you're doing, you be careful. And remember, you deserve to be happy. You hear me? You deserve to be happy." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak without breaking down completely, and hurried to the employee bathroom to change out of my uniform. In the mirror, I saw a woman I barely recognized, 46 years old, gray-streaked hairlines of endurance and suffering mapped across her face, but something new in her eyes, something that looked almost like hope. Instead of turning left toward home when I left the diner, I turned right, heading downtown toward the center of our small community. Each step carried me farther from my past and closer to an uncertain but chosen future. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, but I barely felt the heat. My entire being was focused on the next phase of my escape. The walk to our house took 20 minutes. The neighborhood was quiet, most people at work or staying indoors to escape the midday heat. I slipped around to the back door, using the key we kept hidden under a cracked flower pot that had been there so long it had become part of the landscape. The house felt different now that I was about to leave it forever. Smaller, somehow, shabbier, filled with the stale air of broken dreams and wasted years. I moved quickly to the bedroom, pried up the loose floorboard with a kitchen knife, and retrieved my escape fund. $3,142, saved over 15 years of secret planning and relentless hope. I stuffed the money into different pockets and compartments of my clothing, not wanting to keep it all in one place. Then I went to the garage, pushed aside rusty lawn equipment that hadn't been used in years, and pulled out the small suitcase I'd hidden behind our ancient water heater. Inside were the few possessions I couldn't bear to leave behind: photographs of my parents, and of Michael as a baby, my mother's locket, a book of poetry that had sustained me through the darkest nights, and enough clothes for a new beginning. Everything that mattered to me fit in a case small enough to carry without attracting attention. Before leaving, I took one final look around the house that had been my prison for so many years. The faded floral wallpaper, the sagging furniture, the water stain on the ceiling that Richard had promised to fix at least a dozen times. None of it had ever been mine, not really. This had been Richard's house, Richard's life, shaped by his needs and his violence. Martha Jean Thompson was finally leaving to find her own life. The bus station was a 20-minute walk through our small downtown area. With each step, I expected to hear Richard's voice calling my name, to feel his hand grabbing my shoulder, to have my escape end before it truly began. But no one stopped me. No one even seemed to notice another middle-aged woman going about her business on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. At the station, I purchased a ticket to Phoenix with a voice that remained steady despite the thunder of my pulse in my ears. The clerk barely looked at me, just slid the ticket across the counter, with the bored efficiency of someone who processed dozens of transactions each day. The bus was half empty when I boarded, choosing a seat near the middle where I wouldn't be too conspicuous. As the engine rumbled to life and we pulled away from the station, I finally allowed myself to exhale the breath I felt I'd been holding for 15 years. I was doing it. I was really doing it. After 2 decades of dreaming and planning and surviving, I was finally free. The landscape outside the bus window rolled by like a movie of my entire life in reverse. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, red rock formations rose majestically against the endless blue sky, and the harsh beauty of the Sonoran Desert stretched to every horizon. For 15 years, this landscape had been the backdrop to my imprisonment. Now, it was the scenery of my liberation. The journey to Phoenix took 2.5 hours every minute, both eternal and instant. I spent the time memorizing Michael's letter, rehearsing what I would say when I saw my son for the first time since he was 4 years old. Would he recognize me? Would I recognize him? What do you say to a child you haven't held in 15 years? As the Phoenix skyline came into view, my anxiety transformed into something approaching panic. What if this had all been some terrible mistake? What if Michael had changed his mind? What if Richard had somehow discovered the plan and was waiting for me at the hotel? But there was no turning back now. The bus pulled into the Phoenix terminal, and I gathered my courage along with my small suitcase. I was Martha Jean Thompson, survivor of 2 decades of abuse, and I had not endured this much to fail now. Following Michael's careful instructions, I found a payphone in the busy terminal and dialed the number he'd provided with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and my throat closed with panic. Then a familiar voice answered. "Hello!" Caroline. My voice cracked on her name like a teenager's. A sharp intake of breath. "Martha, is that really you?" "Yes," I whispered. "I'm here. I'm in Phoenix." Her voice shifted, becoming crisp and efficient in the way I remembered from our childhood when she took charge of difficult situations. "Stay exactly where you are. I'll be there in 15 minutes. I'm driving a blue Ford Mustang." 15 minutes. After 15 years of separation, just 15 more minutes until I would see my sister again until this impossible plan would either succeed completely or fall apart entirely. I sat on a bench outside the terminal, clutching my suitcase and watching every blue car that approached. When the Mustang pulled up to the curb, a woman stepped out who was unmistakably Caroline, but transformed by time and experience. Taller than I remembered, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, wearing clothes that spoke of independence and success. She looked like what I might have become if my life had taken a different path. Our eyes met across the distance, and time seemed to stop. Then she was rushing toward me, and I was standing, and we were clinging to each other like drowning women who had suddenly found solid ground. "You came," she kept saying, her voice thick with tears. "You actually came. I wasn't sure, after all these years. But you came." "Is he here?" I managed to ask through my own tears. "Is Michael really here?" She pulled back to frame my face with her hands studying me, as if she couldn't quite believe I was real. "He's at the hotel. He wanted to come with me, but we thought it would be safer if I came alone first. Less conspicuous." She helped me into the Mustang, stowing my small suitcase in the trunk, with the careful attention of someone who understood that this bag contained everything I had left of my old life. As she drove through Phoenix traffic, she filled the silence with updates about Michael that went far beyond what I'd learned through letters. "He's nervous," she said with a small laugh, navigating through afternoon traffic with the confidence of a woman who had learned to take care of herself in the world. "He's been pacing the hotel room all day. I told him to try the pool, maybe swim some laps to calm down, but he wouldn't leave in case you called early." My throat was too tight with emotion to respond, but Caroline seemed to understand my need to hear about my son. "He's amazing, Martha. Brilliant, kind, determined as hell when he sets his mind to something. He gets that from you, that stubborn streak. He's going to graduate summa cum laude next year. Engineering firms are already recruiting him." Pride swelled in my chest so powerfully, I thought it might stop my heart. My son. My beautiful, brilliant boy, who had grown into a man while I lived another life entirely. "Does he hate me?" I finally managed to whisper. "For staying away so long, for sending him away in the first place?" Caroline's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "He did for a while, when he was younger, and didn't understand the whole situation. But not anymore, Martha. Now, he just wants his mother back." The Holiday Inn rose before us like a monument to possibility. Caroline pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine, reaching over to squeeze my hand with surprising strength. "Room 215, she said softly. "Second floor, he's waiting for you." I sat in the car for a moment, gathering courage that seemed to have deserted me now that the moment had actually arrived. Through the windshield, I could see the hotel entrance, the elevator that would carry me to my son, the future that waited beyond those glass doors. "What if he's disappointed?" I asked Caroline. "What if the reality of his broken-down, middle-aged mother doesn't match whatever he's imagined all these years?" Caroline turned to face me fully, her expression serious. "Martha, that boy has carried your photograph in his wallet for 15 years. He's memorized every letter you ever wrote. He organized this entire escape plan because he loves you more than his own safety. You think he's going to be disappointed by the woman who sacrificed everything to keep him safe?" With those words echoing in my mind, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the hotel, my legs feeling like water beneath me. The lobby was busy with afternoon travelers, people beginning or ending journeys that seemed insignificant compared to the reunion I was about to experience. The elevator ride to the second floor lasted forever and no time at all. The hallway stretched ahead of me, carpeted in neutral tones that would have been soothing under any other circumstances. Room 213, 214. And there it was. Room 215. I stood before the door, frozen, unable to lift my hand to knock. Behind this door was my son, the child I'd sent away to save his life. The young man who had grown up without me, but somehow forgiven me anyway. What if I wasn't enough? What if 15 years of separation had created a gulf too wide to bridge? Before I could lose my nerve completely, the door opened. And there he was, Michael, my son. 20 years old, tall, much taller than I'd imagined, with broad shoulders and Richard's strong jawline, but my eyes, my mother's curly dark hair, and something in his expression that was entirely his own. He wore a simple button-down shirt and jeans, but he looked to me like the most magnificent person who had ever existed. "Mom," he said, and his voice was a man's voice now, deep and sure, nothing like the little boy's voice that lived in my memory. I couldn't speak. 15 years of words I'd wanted to say to him died in my throat, replaced by a sound that was part sob, part prayer, part pure joy. We stood frozen for a moment that contained lifetimes, looking at each other across the chasm of years that had separated us. Then he stepped forward, and I was in his arms, enveloped by the embrace of my child, who was no longer a child. He was so tall, I had to reach up to put my arms around his neck, so solid and strong that holding him felt like grabbing onto safety itself. This was my baby, my little boy, who used to fall asleep in my arms, now grown into a man who was holding me as if I were something precious and fragile. "You came," he whispered into my hair, echoing Caroline's words. "You really came." And I broke. 15 years of grief and guilt and desperate love poured out of me in sobs that seemed to come from the depths of my soul. I cried for the years we'd lost, for the birthdays I'd missed, for the little boy who had grown up without his mother, for the woman who had survived hell to reach this moment. Through it all, Michael held me, this strong young man who had somehow emerged from our family's trauma with enough love to orchestrate my rescue. When I finally managed to speak, the words tumbled out in a rush of regret and explanation. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I sent you away. I'm sorry I stayed behind. I'm sorry for all the years we lost, for every birthday and Christmas and milestone I missed. I'm sorry." He pulled back to look at me, framing my face with hands that were larger than mine now, gentle hands that belonged to a man of character and compassion. "Don't," he said firmly. "Don't apologize for saving my life. Don't apologize for being the strongest person I've ever known. You did what you had to do, and I understand now. I understand everything." Caroline slipped into the room behind us, quietly closing the door to give us privacy for this reunion 15 years in the making. The three of us sat together as afternoon turned to evening, sharing the stories of our separate lives, filling in the gaps that letters could never completely bridge. Michael showed me photographs of him at various ages, growing taller and more confident, graduating from high school, starting college, becoming the remarkable young man who sat before me now. Caroline added details to stories I'd only known through carefully worded letters, painting a picture of a childhood that had been happy, despite its unusual circumstances. What happens now? I finally asked the question that had haunted me since first receiving Michael's letter. "Richard will look for me. He'll never stop looking." Michael's expression hardened, and for a moment I saw something of his father in his face. Not the violence or cruelty, but the determination and strength that Richard could have used for good if he'd made different choices. "Let him look," he said with quiet certainty. "We've thought of everything, Mom. The apartment in Seattle is in Caroline's name. The job is arranged through friends who understand the situation. We've consulted with lawyers about restraining orders and legal protection." Caroline leaned forward, her voice taking on the practical tone I remembered from our childhood. "Phoenix police are already watching the bus station in case he follows your trail here. But we're not staying long enough for that to matter. Our flight to Seattle leaves first thing tomorrow morning." Seattle, a city of rain and evergreen trees and water, as different from the Arizona desert as I could imagine. A place where Richard would never think to look for a woman who had spent her entire life in small, dusty towns. "What about your studies?" I asked Michael. "Your scholarship at the University of Minnesota?" He smiled my smile, I realized, with a jolt of recognition. "I'm transferring to the University of Washington for my senior year. Seattle's a great city for engineers, and I'll only be 30 minutes from your new apartment. That evening, as we sat in a restaurant near the hotel sharing our first meal together in 15 years, our carefully planned escape took an unexpected turn. Caroline had gone to the ladies' room when Michael leaned across the table, his expression suddenly serious. "Mom, there's something else I need to tell you. Something Caroline doesn't know about." My heart lurched. "What is it?" "Dr. Cohen, the woman you mentioned in some of your letters, the one who tried to help you back in Sun City." I nodded, remembering the kind physician who had offered resources and quiet support through pamphlets left under her plate at the diner. "She contacted me 3 months ago. Through Caroline's lawyer, the one who helped with my guardianship papers. Apparently, she's been documenting Richard's behavior for years, not just with you, but with other women in town." My breath caught. "Other women?" "She thinks he's been involved in at least 3 cases of domestic violence since you sent me away. Women who came to her clinic with injuries that fit a pattern. She's been quietly building a case working with law enforcement in Phoenix, who specialize in these kinds of situations." Michael reached across the table to take my hand. "Mom, Richard isn't just an abusive husband. Dr. Cohen has evidence that he's been involved in more serious crimes. Assault cases that were never properly investigated because of his connections with local police." The restaurant suddenly felt too bright, too loud. "Why didn't she do something sooner?" "She tried. But in a small town where Richard has friends in the police department, it's hard to make charges stick. She needed someone with legal standing to file a formal complaint, someone with detailed knowledge of his pattern of violence." Understanding dawned on me like a cold sunrise. "Me? She's hoping you'll be willing to give a statement once you're safely in Seattle, with legal protection and distance from his influence. Your testimony combined with her documentation and the other cases could finally put him away." Caroline returned from the ladies' room, immediately sensing the tension at our table. "What's wrong? What happened?" Michael explained the situation while I sat in stunned silence, processing the realization that my escape was about more than just personal freedom. It was about stopping Richard from hurting anyone else the way he'd hurt me, the way he'd hurt our son. "This changes things," Caroline said, her practical mind already working through the implications. "If Richard realizes you're not just running away, but potentially exposing him to criminal prosecution, he'll be desperate," I finished, "more dangerous than ever." As if summoned by our conversation, Michael's attention was suddenly drawn to something over my shoulder. His face went pale, and he gripped my hand with sudden urgency. "Don't turn around," he said quietly. "But I think we need to leave. Now." "What is it?" Caroline asked, her voice tightly controlled. "There's a man at the bar who's been watching our table for the past 10 minutes. Tall, graying hair, looks like he hasn't slept in days." My blood turned to ice in my veins. "Richard." Somehow, impossibly, my husband had tracked me to Phoenix. The man who had threatened for 20 years to find me if I ever tried to leave had made good on his promise. The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal clarity of a nightmare. Caroline quietly signaled for the check while Michael helped me to my feet, his hand steady on my elbow despite the tension radiating through his body. We moved toward the restaurant's rear exit, trying to appear casual, while my heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was sure everyone could hear it. "We almost made it." Well, well, if it isn't my loving wife and her accomplices." Richard's voice stopped us just steps from the exit. I turned to see him rising from his bar stool, swaying slightly drunk, but not drunk enough to be harmless. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his hair uncombed, his eyes wild with the kind of rage I'd learned to recognize as a precursor to violence. But there was something else in his expression now. Something that looked almost like fear. "Hello, Richard," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "How did you find me?" "You think I'm stupid, Martha. You think I didn't notice you acting strange these past weeks? I've been watching you, following you. Saw you get on that bus like some kind of runaway teenager." He took a step closer, and I instinctively moved back, bumping into Michael's solid presence behind me. My son, this man I barely knew but loved with every fiber of my being, stepped partially in front of me, a protective gesture that was both touching and terrifying. "You must be Michael," Richard said, his voice taking on a false friendliness that fooled no one. "My boy, all grown up now, I see. Ready to meet your real father?" "I know exactly who my father is," Michael replied, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel. "And I know what he did to my mother and to me. The question is, what are you doing here?" Richard's mask of false pleasantry slipped. "What am I doing here? I'm collecting my property. My wife. Taking her home where she belongs." "She doesn't belong to you," Caroline said, speaking for the first time since Richard had appeared. "No one belongs to you, Richard. Martha is a grown woman, making her own choices." Ah, the interfering sister. Still filling my wife's head with poison, I see. Richard's attention shifted to Caroline, and I saw his hands clench into fists. "You're the one who stole my son. You're the one who turned him against me." "I saved him," Caroline replied without backing down. "From growing up in a house where violence was normal, from learning that it's acceptable to hurt people you claim to love." The restaurant had gone quiet, other diners sensing the tension and danger radiating from our group. I could see the manager approaching, probably to ask us to take our dispute elsewhere, unaware that he was walking into a situation that could explode into violence at any moment. That's when Richard made his fatal mistake. "You know what, Martha? I'm done playing games. You're coming home with me right now, and we're going to forget this little adventure ever happened." He reached for my arm, his fingers closing around my wrist with the crushing grip I remembered from years of abuse. But I wasn't the same woman who had endured his violence for 2 decades. Something had changed in me during those final weeks of planning my escape, some fundamental shift that had been building since the moment I'd first read Michael's letter. "No," I said clearly, loudly enough that everyone in the restaurant could hear. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Richard. I'm done being afraid. I'm done pretending that what you did to me and Michael was acceptable. I'm done protecting your reputation at the cost of my own life." His grip tightened, and I saw his other hand draw back in preparation for the kind of blow I'd received countless times before. But this time, Michael was there. My son moved faster than I thought possible, stepping between us and catching Richard's wrist in mid-swing. At 20, Michael was taller and stronger than his father, and years of construction work hadn't been enough to maintain Richard's physical advantages over a healthy young man. "Don't!" Michael's voice carried a warning that seemed to freeze Richard in place. "Don't ever touch her again." For a moment, father and son faced each other, and I saw Richard recognize that his power was broken. The little boy he had terrorized had grown into a man who wouldn't be intimidated, and the wife he had controlled for 20 years was no longer alone and defenseless. That's when we heard the sirens. The police arrived with the efficiency of a well-coordinated operation, not the casual response to a restaurant disturbance that I might have expected. As 3 officers entered through the front door, I realized this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had been expecting trouble. Richard Thompson. The lead officer, a tall woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes, approached our group with her hand resting casually on her sidearm. "We'd like to have a word with you." Richard's face went through a rapid series of changes, surprise, confusion, and finally something that looked like trapped panic. "I don't know what this is about, officer. I'm just here trying to talk to my wife." "Detective Martinez, Phoenix PD. We've been in communication with Dr. Sarah Cohen in Sun City regarding some ongoing investigations. She suggested you might be in the area." I looked at Michael in amazement, understanding dawning. "Dr. Cohen knew. She's been working with Phoenix police for months," Michael confirmed quietly. "When I told her about our plan to bring you here, she coordinated with Detective Martinez to make sure you'd be protected if Richard showed up." Detective Martinez continued addressing Richard, her voice professionally calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Mr. Thompson, we have some questions about several assault cases in Sun City, as well as some financial irregularities from your time at First National Bank. We'd appreciate if you'd come with us voluntarily." "This is harassment," Richard blustered, but I could see the fear in his eyes now. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a respected member of my community. Sir, we have multiple witnesses and medical documentation spanning several years. Dr. Cohen has been very thorough in her record-keeping. Detective Martinez gestured toward the restaurant exit. You can come with us now, or we can make this more difficult for everyone. Richard's gaze swung back to me, and for a moment, I saw the full measure of his rage and desperation. This was the most dangerous moment when men like Richard realize their control is completely broken. They often lash out with the mindless fury of cornered animals. This is your fault, Martha, he snarled, taking a step toward me despite the police presence. You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, my reputation, my life. You vindictive bitch, you've destroyed. He never finished the sentence. Detective Martinez moved with practiced efficiency, restraining Richard before he could reach me, her partners flanking them both with the smooth coordination of officers who had handled similar situations many times before. Richard Thompson, you're under arrest for assault, battery, and violation of multiple restraining orders. You have the right to remain silent. As they led him away in handcuffs, Richard continued shouting threats and accusations, his voice growing more desperate and incoherent with each step. Other diners watched in fascination and horror as the man who had terrorized me for 20 years was finally held accountable for his actions. I stood in the sudden silence, hardly able to believe what I had just witnessed. After decades of Richard's violence going unpunished, of his threats and intimidation being dismissed or ignored, he was finally facing justice. Detective Martinez returned to our table, her expression softening now that the immediate danger had passed. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Cohen mentioned that you might be willing to provide a statement about your experiences. I want you to know that's entirely your choice, and there's no pressure either way. I looked at Michael and Caroline, these two people who had risked their own safety to give me a chance at freedom, then back at the detective who represented the possibility of real justice. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'll tell you everything, every detail, every incident, every threat. If my testimony can prevent him from hurting anyone else the way he hurt me and my son, then I'll tell you everything. 3 months later, I stood at the window of my small apartment in Seattle, watching rain fall softly on the evergreen trees that lined the street below. The sound of water on glass was still foreign to me after a lifetime in the desert, but I was learning to love it, this gentle, nurturing precipitation, so different from the harsh, unforgiving climate of Arizona. The apartment was modest but comfortable, furnished with simple pieces that Caroline and I had chosen together during my first week in the city. Nothing fancy, but everything was mine chosen, freely arranged according to my preferences, existing in a space where I felt safe for the first time in decades. Most importantly, it was only a 30-minute bus ride from the University of Washington, where Michael was finishing his senior year in engineering, with the same dedication and excellence he'd shown throughout his education. We had dinner together twice a week, slowly rebuilding the relationship that had been interrupted by 15 years of separation. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes we'd sit across from each other at a restaurant, struggling to find conversation beyond the safe topics of his studies and my work at the bookstore. We were strangers, learning to be family again, two people connected by love and DNA, but divided by years of living completely separate lives. But we were making progress. Just the previous week, Michael had laughed at something I said, really laughed, the kind of spontaneous joy that reminded me of the little boy he'd once been. And sometimes, when he was concentrating on something, I'd catch a glimpse of familiar expressions, gestures inherited from me or my mother, proof that some bonds can't be broken by time or distance. The bookstore where I worked was exactly what I'd needed, quiet, peaceful, filled with stories and possibilities. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was a gentlewoman who had asked no questions about my past, but offered steady employment and patient kindness as I learned to navigate a world where I could make my own decisions without fear of violent consequences. Richard's trial had concluded the previous month. With Dr. Cohen's meticulous documentation, testimony from his other victims, and my own detailed account of 20 years of abuse, the jury had convicted him on multiple charges. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison with additional civil penalties that would prevent him from ever profiting from his story or contacting any of his victims. More importantly, the trial had been covered extensively in Arizona newspapers, destroying the reputation he'd tried so hard to protect. Everyone in Sun City now knew the truth about Richard Thompson, that the charming war hero had been a violent criminal who had terrorized women for decades. His few remaining friends had distanced themselves, his family had disowned him, and his legacy was forever tainted by the revelation of his true character. Justice had finally been served, but for me, the real victory wasn't his imprisonment, it was my freedom. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Michael standing in the hallway, rain dripping from his jacket, holding 2 cups of coffee from the cafe near campus. "Thought you might like some company," he said with the easy smile that was becoming more frequent as we grew comfortable with each other again. "And I have news." "Huh, good news or bad news?" I asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Very good news. I got the job." The job was with a prestigious engineering firm in Seattle, a position that would allow him to stay in the city after graduation, rather than moving elsewhere for work. We'd discussed it several times, my fear that he might be limiting his opportunities to stay near me, warring with my selfish desire to keep my son close now that we'd finally found each other again. "Are you sure?" I asked. "You had that offer from the firm in California that paid more?" He said, settling into my small living room as if he belonged there. "I've spent 15 years without you. I'm not going anywhere unless you decide you want to get rid of me." We sat together in comfortable silence, drinking our coffee and watching the rain paint patterns on the window. Outside, the city of Seattle went about its business, people hurrying under umbrellas, cars navigating wet streets, life continuing in all its ordinary beautiful complexity. "Do you ever regret it?" Michael asked suddenly. "Sending me away, staying behind all those years you lost?" It was a question he'd asked in various forms during our months of reconnection, and I understood his need to hear the answer repeatedly. The choices I'd made had shaped both our lives in profound ways, and he was still processing the magnitude of what I'd sacrificed for his safety. "I regret the circumstances that made those choices necessary," I said carefully. "I regret marrying a man who turned out to be capable of such violence. I regret that you had to grow up knowing your mother had sent you away, even for the best reasons. But the choice itself, no, Michael, I don't regret it." I turned to face him fully, this remarkable young man who had somehow emerged from our family's trauma with enough love and strength to rescue his mother. "Look at who you became. Look at the man you are, kind, intelligent, brave enough to risk your own safety to save someone else. If I had kept you in that house, if you had grown up seeing violence as normal, would you be the same person? I don't think so." "And you?" he asked. "What about what it cost you?" "Those years weren't lost, sweetheart. They were invested. Invested in your safety, your future, your chance to become who you were meant to be. Every day I survived was a day closer to this moment, sitting in my own apartment, with my son, both of us free and safe and able to choose our own futures." 6 months later, Caroline came to visit for Thanksgiving, our first holiday together as a family in over 15 years. She arrived bearing photograph stories and a large suitcase full of what she called family archives. "I thought it was time you had these back," she said, opening the suitcase to reveal carefully preserved mementos from Michael's childhood report cards, school photographs, art projects, and yes, all 172 letters I had written over the years. I held the letters with trembling hands, barely able to believe Caroline had kept them all. My handwriting stared back at me from envelope after envelope, evidence of a mother's love maintained across impossible distances. "I used to read them to him when he was small," Caroline explained. "Later, when he was older and angry about the situation, I'd reread them to remind him of how much you loved him. And when he started planning your rescue, these letters were what convinced him that you'd want to be saved." That evening, as we prepared dinner together in my small kitchen, I marveled at the normalcy of it all. 3 generations of family chopping vegetables and sharing stories, laughing about Michael's first attempts to cook for himself in college. It was the kind of ordinary moment I'd dreamed about during the darkest years of my marriage. After dinner, Michael presented me with an early Christmas gift, a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. "For new stories," he said simply. "You've spent so many years writing letters about your life. Maybe now you can write about the life you're going to live." That night, after Caroline and Michael had returned to their hotels, I sat at my kitchen table and opened the journal to its first page. For a long time, I stared at the blank paper, overwhelmed by the possibilities it represented. Then I began to write. "My name is Martha Jean Thompson, and today I am 51 years old. For the first time in decades, when I write those words, I feel joy instead of despair. Today, I am not a victim or a survivor. I am simply a woman beginning the next chapter of her life, surrounded by people who love her and free to make her own choices about what comes next. I have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in the face of it. I have learned that love sometimes requires impossible sacrifices, but that those sacrifices can produce miracles. Most importantly, I have learned that it is never too late to reclaim your life, no matter how hopeless your situation might seem. To anyone reading this who finds themselves in similar circumstances, you are not alone. Help exists even when it's not immediately visible. People care even when they seem indifferent, and change is possible even when it seems impossible. Your life belongs to you. Not to anyone who tries to control you through fear or violence. Not to the circumstances that seem to trap you. Not to the voice in your head that says you're too weak or too old or too damaged to start over. Your life belongs to you, and you have the right to claim it. 5 years have passed since that April day when I walked out of my prison and into freedom. As I write this, I am 56 years old, and my life bears no resemblance to the existence I endured for 2 decades in Arizona. Michael graduated summa cum laude and is now a successful structural engineer working on projects that will provide safe, beautiful buildings for generations to come. He married a wonderful woman named Sarah Yes, named after Dr. Cohen, whom he credits with helping save both our lives. They live just 20 minutes from my apartment, and I see them regularly for dinners, holidays, and the simple pleasure of family time. Last month, Sarah told me she's pregnant. I'm going to be a grandmother, a title I'd never dared hope to claim. This child will grow up knowing love without violent security, without fear, and the strength that comes from a family that chooses each other every single day. Caroline visits several times a year, and we've rebuilt the sisterly relationship that Richard's control had nearly destroyed. She's proud of the life I've created, proud of the strength I found when it mattered most, and proud to have played a part in our family's survival. Dr. Sarah Cohen and I correspond regularly. She continues her work in Sun City now, with additional funding and support for domestic violence prevention programs. She tells me that my willingness to testify against Richard has encouraged other women to come forward, creating a network of survivors who refuse to suffer in silence. Richard remains in prison where he will stay for at least 5 more years. I don't think about him often anymore, but when I do, I feel pity rather than fear. He had opportunities for redemption, chances to choose love over violence, and he rejected them all. His prison is largely of his own making, while mine was imposed by his choices. I still work at the bookstore, but I've also begun volunteering with local organizations that support women escaping domestic violence. My story, as painful as it is, has become a source of hope for women who believe escape is impossible. When I tell them about my 15 years of endurance and planning, about the son who rescued his mother, about the new life that began at age 46, I see something change in their eyes. Hope is contagious, it turns out. And sometimes the stories of those who survived can light the path for those still trapped in the darkness. The Seattle rain continues to amaze me with its gentle persistence. So different from the harsh, punishing climate of my former life, this water nourishes rather than depletes, sustains rather than destroys. I've learned to love storms here, to find comfort in the sound of rain against my windows, knowing that I am safe and warm and free to choose whether to go outside or stay in. Sometimes I dream about the desert, not nightmares about Richard or our house of horrors, but dreams about the stark beauty of the landscape that taught me endurance. The saguaro cacti standing tall despite brutal conditions, the way flowers bloom in the desert after rare rains, the endless sky that reminds you how vast the world really is. I survived that desert, both the geographical one and the emotional wasteland of my marriage. I survived, and more than that, I discovered that survival can become the foundation for joy. My name is Martha Jean Thompson. I am 56 years old, a mother soon to be a grandmother, a survivor, and a free woman. The lines on my face still tell a story of both joy and pain, but now the joy is winning. Sometimes the most painful choices are the ones we make out of love. But sometimes love gives us the strength to make choices we never thought possible. And sometimes, after decades in the darkness, we discover that freedom tastes like rain on your face and sounds like your grown son's laughter and feels like waking up each morning without fear. Sometimes we discover that home isn't a place at all. It's the people who love you enough to help you find your way back to yourself.